Hello listener, the Nameless Scholar here. After talking about 3 traitor legions in a row, I have decided to talk about Aureleius Legion this time. The Thousand Sons. Magnus was the first of the Primarchs to recognize the existence and the threat of the ruinous powers posed to mankind. And because of this, the Thousand Sons became the first legion to be targeted for destruction by the forces of chaos. Though it cost them dear, those that survived the Space Wolves' slaughter were pivotal in bringing the Dornian Heresy to an end. As the most powerful battle psychers in the Imperium, they are feared and mistrusted, even by the people they selflessly defend against the encroaching darkness. During the Great Diaspora, when humanity colonized the galaxy, the world of Prospero was chosen by the mutants and psychers that settled it precisely because of its remoteness and lack of mineral resources. In their splendid isolation, these outcasts from the rest of humanity created Tisca, a shining city of light, learning, and culture amongst the barren wasteland. Although they had been cut off for thousands of years, tales still abounded of the howling mobs that had persecuted their forefathers, and they lived in quiet dread that their haven would be invaded. Unsurprisingly, when the infant Magnus's incubation chamber fell to earth amongst the shining silver towers in Tisca's central plaza, the population was gripped with terror. Finally, overcoming their trepidation, they found it to be not an orbital bombardment or the vanguard of an invasion force, but a battered, scorched, and damaged wreck containing a badly injured child. Though he was near the point of death when they first found him, the boy displayed a tenacious will and remarkable constitution. Under the ministrations of the commune's healers, he quickly returned to robust health, but nothing could be done to save the boy's right eye. An ugly welt of scar tissue covered the socket. But in a society where mutation and deformity were rife, this was little cause for comment. He was named Magnus, or more usually and affectionately Magnus the Red, after his ruddy complexion and the color of his unruly mane of hair that he doggedly refused to cut. Magnus quickly grew to vibrant maturity and threw himself wholeheartedly into learning. He was most often to be found poring over ancient tomes in the city's extensive libraries and animatedly debating with wizened scholars many times his own age. Knowledge was his passion, and with the fiery certainty of youth, he believed that no subject was beyond his mastery. It was the study of the hermetic arts of alchemy and sorcery that changed his life forever. Doing so awakened him to the true power of the warp, an act which leveled the building in which he had been studying. As his psychic powers blossomed, he became aware of both the gods of chaos and his father, the Emperor of mankind. Though separated by half a galaxy, the Emperor and Magnus recognized each other for what they were. With his insatiable thirst for knowledge, Magnus eagerly learned about every aspect of their young Imperium, of the Great Crusade, and the search for his brother Primarchs. Through his expanded acuity and the tutelage of his father, Magnus became the first of the Primarchs to learn of the terrible threat posed by the ruinous powers. Even as the Emperor taught him these things, he swore Magnus to secrecy, explaining that the threat was so grave that even knowledge of their existence would be enough to seduce some to their worship. Magnus had seen to his cost the palpable link between sorcery and chaos, but argued that the ruinous powers could easily use such ignorance to corrupt the unwary. Despite this, he was unable to persuade his father, the Emperor, spoke of a grand plan that would one day see humanity strong enough to resist chaos's wiles. But until then, he solemnly forbade Magnus from telling anyone outside of their own legion, even his own brother Primarchs, of what he had learned. By the time the Emperor and the 15th Legion of Astartes had reached Prospero, father and son knew each other as though they never been parted. Despite all of Magnus's assurances, the arrival of the Master of Mankind and his fleet of warships was greeted with suspicion by the people of Prospero, but the Emperor's legendary charisma quickly won them over. To further assuage their fears, Magnus had his legion build their fortress monastery at the heart of Tisca, in the hope that they would no longer have to apprehensively watch the skies. The legion itself had particular reason to celebrate finding their Primarch. Although they had not recruited on the basis of psychic talents, the gene seed they had been patterned upon had boosted their innate abilities and triggered latent ones. As a side effect, it also caused a very high incidence of both genetic and implant mutation among the brethren, to the extent that the legion was smaller than most of the others. As the home of the mutant and the psyker, Prospero was the perfect place for such a legion. By the time Magnus was ready to join the Great Crusade, his original 1,000 sons had expanded moderately beyond their nominal level by the cream of Prospero's talents. As they set out to do the Emperor's great work, what they lacked in conventional numbers was more than made up for with their highly trained battle psychers, able to kill an enemy with but a thought. As Magnus and his new legion ventured across the stars, it gave them an opportunity to gain that which they craved the most: knowledge. Each world brought into compliance with the Emperor's will revealed to them the learning and insights of a new culture, as well as the countless human societies. The myriad Xenos breeds were also a constant source of wonder. From the subtle Eldar to the brutal Orcs, each new sample was characterized, dissected, and catalogued. This expansion also brought with it fresh dangers. Even forewarned against the ruinous powers, the 1,000 Sons still suffered losses. Every battle brother that fell hardened their hearts against the evil of chaos, and turned Magnus's thoughts to the casualties sustained by the other legions, who had no concept or defense against the threat they faced. Their travels across the galaxy brought them into contact with many of Magnus's brother Primarchs. Some in particular, Horus of the Lunavulves and Lorgar of the Wordbearers, became firm friends. Others, such as Mortarion of the Death Guard and Leman Russ, the feral Primarch of the Space Wolves, took an instant dislike to Magnus and everything he stood for. The uncouth Russ called him mutant, sorcerer, unclean, and even a Cyclops, after the one-eyed giant of Terran legend. At every meeting, be it cordial or adversarial, Magnus respected the Emperor's demand to keep silent about the nature of chaos, despite the crushing certainty that ignorance left his brothers vulnerable to the predations of the ruinous powers. Magnus bore his brother's harsh words with good grace, in the certainty that once on the field of battle, all enmity would be placed aside. This was tested most sorely on the fortress world of Bartok, where a campaign by the Space Wolves to bring the planet into imperial compliance had degenerated into a bloody stalemate. In order to bring the campaign to a rapid conclusion, the Emperor himself had ordered the 1,000 Sons to reinforce the assault. The headstrong Leman Russ detested the idea of being seen to need the help of another legion, especially one he had so publicly denounced, but he grudgingly submitted to his father's decree. Even with the might of 2 legions, It soon became clear why Russ had struggled. The final and greatest city was protected by directed energy fields and ringed trenches, strong points and bunker networks resulting in brutally effective interlocking fields of fire. The approaches had been turned into a killing ground worthy of those designed by Perturabo or Dorn. As Russ prepared to throw his forces into yet another headlong charge against the enemy guns, Magnus and his legion exposed the weak link in the Bartok defense. All across the battle zone, the Thousand Suns reached into weak, unguarded minds and urged them to turn their guns on their friends. Even as Russ's wolves advanced, heavy weapon emplacements tracked away from them to fire upon each other. The doomed forlorn hope was transformed into a famous victory, and once inside the lines of defense, the city quickly fell. Perversely, the Space Wolves did not appreciate this at all, and called it sorcery and evil intent, though Magnus well knew the difference between warp-tainted magics and the pure psychic talents his legion deployed. Russ could not be reasoned with. Only a rapid departure from the war zone averted a fractial bloodshed. Magnus hoped that never again putting his legion in a position to fight alongside the Space Wolves would allow his brother's anger to cool, but by then, the damage had already been done. Just before the Emperor was set to return to Terra, leaving Horus in supreme command of the Great Crusade, he called his Primarchs together to the planet of Nicaea. There, he sought to address the increasingly acrimonious disputes that had broken out over the nature of psychic ability. Mortarion, Dorn, Korax, and of course, Leman Russ led the charge, saying that there was no boundary between psychic abilities and the use of destructive sorceries. It was all a matter of degrees, with one inevitably leading to the other. The Emperor's decision to withhold knowledge about the nature of chaos had not stopped the Primarchs from sensing its dangers, and as Magnus had feared, some lashed out against Psykers, the eternal scapegoats. Hamstrung by the Emperor's decree, Magnus realized that no words of his could pacify the growing mob. He desperately begged a private audience with his father, and in a move both practical and symbolic, proposed that starting with himself, every member of the Thousand Suns be soul-bound to the Emperor, just as soul-binding fortified astropaths against the horrors of the warp. The rite would purge and protect the Legion from the temptations of sorcery, and be a palpable sign of their loyalty. The Emperor agreed to this elegant solution, and the act was performed that very night. When the Primarchs and their attendants filed into the council chamber the next morning, they saw Magnus standing proudly alongside his father, his one eye socket an empty wound. The process of soul binding, of merging essences with the psychic might of the Emperor, had burned out his optic nerve and left the Cyclops blind. But Magnus was filled with a second sight that left him far from vulnerable. Though it pacified most of the judgment, did nothing to assuage Leman Russ, who stormed from the chamber and into the service of the Blood God. Before the legions left Nicaea, Magnus met with his brother Primarch, Lorgar of the Word-Bearers. He was a pure soul, genuinely happy for the great honor that he saw his friend had been given. Magnus had long held his tongue about the ruinous powers, but it had cost him his eye, and feared that before long it would cost them all far more. For the first time, Magnus broke the vow to his father and warned Lorgar of the threat posed by chaos. The dire news was received gladly, as it reinforced all that the word-bearers believed. Their piety and dedication to spread the worship of the Emperor as a deity stood vindicated as a vital to the continuation of the human race. The Thousand Sons returned from Terra irrevocably changed. Though the soul binding had taken their sight, they were given a psychic awareness of their environment that was far superior. It had also given them a measure of inner strength, a touch of the Emperor's reflected aura, as it were that they had not even known they had been missing. The most obvious outward sign of their change was shown in their helms, which they had reforged on the journey back to Prospero, into unnerving eyeless masks. They still retained the ability to obtain detailed information on their surroundings from their suit's autosenses, something that became of particular importance in the presence of psychic blanks, such as Sisters of Silence, as well as eliminating the need for the vision-enhancing effects of the oculobe implant. The soul binding also had the welcome effect of reducing the rate and severity of mutation within their bodies and gene seed. They also brought back with them a member of the Adeptus Custodes, though ostensibly sent as the Emperor's personal envoy to monitor the progress of the soul binding. Magnus suspected that his father had learned of the confession to Lorgar, and the guard was a reminder that he was being watched closely. Just as the newly transformed Legion prepared to return to the Great Crusade, Magnus received intelligence of the utmost importance. The archenemy had made a move against Horus. While visiting the War Master, a word-bearer's chaplain named Erebus had recognized the malaise that Horus had contracted on Davin was in fact nothing less than possession by a powerful demonic entity. Only through an epic act of heroism that required both spiritual salvation from Erebus and the combined psychic might of the entire Thousand Sons Legion could the warp creature be cast out and Horus's life saved. In a terrible irony, before they could even recover from the exertions of saving one Primarch from chaos, another descended upon Prospero, intent on planetary annihilation. Without warning, drop pods and assault craft lit up the sky like comets, and the worst fears of the people of Prospero were realized. Distracted by the events of Davin, and it is suspected, with their precognitive skills blunted by Korn's power, the Space Wolves' fleet devastated the planet's orbital defenses before any kind of effective resistance could be mustered. The newly built cities were turned into funeral pyres, killing all those who had come from across the Imperium seeking protection, though shielded from orbital bombardment behind powerful energy fields. Ray figures were seen massing just outside Tisca for a grand offensive. Unthinkable as it was, Magnus sanctioned his legion to use lethal force against other Astartes. Before the Thousand Sons had always held back their true power for fear of alienating their allies, but in the face of extinction, they threw caution to the wind. They lured their enemies into ambushes on the outskirts of Tisca, first disorienting them with their psychic powers, and then cutting them down in lethal crossfires. Just as the battle seemed to be tipping in the Thousand Sons' favor, the power of Korn tore through the Imperium like a tidal wave, affecting every psyker on the planet. The Thousand Sons, protected as they were by the soul binding, were left powerless and dazed. The civilian population was affected far more gravely. Those who survived boiled madly from their shelters, only to be torn apart by the bestial, inhuman creatures that the Space Wolves had become. With his world turned to ash and its people murdered, Magnus strove to access his psychic powers, but to no avail. Under such physical and mental assault, it was all the Thousand Sons could do to stay alive. When Leman Russ inevitably came for Magnus, he was unrecognizable, a blood-drunk beast steeped in the power of Khorne. Only through the custodian's heroic self-sacrifice was Magnus able to escape with his life. With the disruption to the Averic plane finally beginning to wane, Magnus was able to obscure his remaining brothers from view and leave the necropolis that Tisca had become. Hearing of Dorn's betrayal at his van, it became clear that the attack on Prospero was just the opening salvo in a much larger war. Even with their numbers so depleted, the Thousand Sons were determined to do what they could to save the Emperor. Following Russ' much larger fleet at a discreet distance, they used their mastery of the warp to delay the enemy and send them far off track. It was hoped that in this way they could buy time for the loyal legions to end the rebellion before they arrived. Their gambit to divert the space wolves into contact with their bitter rivals, the Dark Angels, sadly did not erupt in the hope for bloodshed. They greeted each other as allies in chaos, although it did at least mean that from then on they were keeping two traitor legions from the Emperor's throat. Their contribution did not come without a price, however. The continuous strain began to take its toll, and towards the end, every day that went past left another brother as a powder-dry corpse inside his power armor. With the Space Wolves and Dark Angels just days from Terra, the Emperor was forced to break the stalemate and confront Dorn directly. Magnus felt the psychic battle going on about the phalanx, but was powerless to intervene. Though the Dornian Heresy was ended that day, it left the Emperor wounded to the core, and Magnus felt every one of those agonies across light years. As the traitor legions scattered to the stars, the Thousand Sons arrived to do what they could, along with the Iron Warriors. Magnus interned the Emperor's paralyzed body within the life-sustaining mechanism of the Astronomicon. Meanwhile, the rest of the Legion put their talents to use in cleansing the taint of the demonic from the planet. Terra had been the site of many desecrations and summonations, and it took decades to ward all of the portals that had been created. The worst sight of all was inside the old Imperial throne room. When Dorn had found that the Emperor had escaped him there, he had desecrated the nascent webway portal that had been under construction. An army of demons had flooded out, and even after the heresy, it took an almighty effort to seal. Magnus threw himself wholeheartedly into finding a way to restore his father's vitality. It became an obsession, with effective command of his legion falling to Captain Araman of the First Great Company. One day, Magnus emerged from the Astronomicon in high spirits, and eschewing all offers of company, left Terra, saying only that the solution was to gather together the Emperor's sons. What was meant by this, he has never explained, not even to his own legion, or to the High Lords of Terra. By this point, most of the Primarchs were either dead or turned to chaos, and as the millennia pass, fewer and fewer remain alive. The Thousand Sons have never grown used to the unsettling nature of their Primarch's frequent disappearances and unheralded returns. At first, his quests were measured in months or years, and he found the time to lead them on the quest to purge the Space Wolves from their homeworld of Fenris. As time went on, Magnus vanished for decades at a time, his whereabouts obscured from even the most determined of seers. In Magnus's absence, Regent Araman went to great lengths to see the Thousand Sons rebuilt. His callous and high-handed attitude towards the lives of allies especially those of the Imperial Army, meant that even as their numbers rose, the regard in which they were held fell. This reputedly earned a furious rebuke from Magnus on his return, after which Ahriman was careful to show more respect for non-psychics, or at least to moderate his public comments. At the end of his life, Regent Ahriman was finally able to redeem himself when the hexagrammatic wars used to seal the webway portal in the old Imperial Palace began to decay and threatened to tear wide open once more. Ahriman was at the forefront of researching a way to permanently close the rift. His divination showed that this could only be done from within, something which, as the preeminent expert, he insisted on doing personally. Despite all of this, there are still some who claim that it was all a ploy, that he survived the process and became the first human to walk the webway's paths and search out the secrets of the Eldar's Black Library, though such guile was certainly part of Ahriman's character. If this was the case, he has never returned to the Imperium to speak of what he found there. Though still nominally commanded by their Primarch, Magnus's lengthy disappearances mean that in practice, the Legion is led by the captain of the First Great Company as the Regent. It is rare enough to find a candidate worthy of becoming an Astartes in a normal Legion, but when they must also be strong and resilient Psykers, the task becomes even more difficult. For this reason, they have never been a large legion, although they have long ago exceeded their nominal 1,000 brothers. Their grand companies are small, and only Fulgrim's self-imposed limit of 30 grand companies has allowed the 1,000 Sons to exceed their numbers. Though they intentionally cultivate a distant and mysterious persona, the 1,000 Sons are forced by their low numbers to frequently work alongside more numerous organizations, such as the Imperial Army. Ever since the damaging days of Regent Ahriman, Magnus has taken great pains to ensure that the 1,000 Sons are perceived by their allies as an invaluable advantage in any battle. So important is this that the 1,000 Sons of any rank may be reprimanded and even demoted for giving their allies the impression they are being treated as disposable cannon fodder. In a legion of battle psychers, the captains of the grand companies are amongst the most potent and skilled, with powers far exceeding those of the chief librarians of any other Astartes. Commanding upwards of 100 squads, each captain is charged with a specific task by the regent. This varies from guarding Holy Terra and combating incursions of the demonic, to prosecuting the long war against the traitor legions. In particular, the berserkers of the Space Wolves, realizing that psychic strength is nothing without the fortitude of faith in the Emperor. The 1,000 Sons were the first legion to import Lorgar's concepts of chaplains. These individuals play a vital role in guiding the moral and spiritual growth of the legion. Initiates who, as Lorgar put it, display a particularly intense, quote, communion with the divine during the soul-binding ritual are marked out for further training with the Reclusium. Just as the chaplains guard their brethren's souls, the Grand Company's Apothecarian and Armory protect their bodies and war gear. Despite this, it has been said that comparatively little care is given to these roles, with positions such as the crewing of vehicles being seen as dumping grounds for those who have not fulfilled their early promise as battle psychers. However, this is not always the case, as among their ranks are brethren able to manifest psychic talents invaluable to these specialties. Such prodigies can perfectly attune themselves to their subjects, able to reach inside matter to re-knit flesh, soothe a restless machine spirit, or reforge a shattered mechanism, and are vital to the Legion's continued existence. As has always been Magnus's intent, the Thousand Sons use their psychic talents to the full on the battlefield, as well as wielding powers that make them formidable opponents. The Legion's commanding officers use their prodigious talents to guide and coordinate the movement of their squads, and those of their allies. Never a numerous legion, they rely heavily upon the Imperial Army, as well as on guidance from the Emperor's Tarot, to strike at the most auspicious time and place. Though this sometimes strikes their allies as intransigence, once committed, they are able to turn the tide of any battle. Individual squads are led by sergeants who are powerful battle psychers in their own right. It is their responsibility to coordinate and focus the less mature abilities of those in their charge. Despite the intensive training they receive to do this, it is an exceptional talent who can effectively direct more than 5 or 6 of his brethren. In this way, each squad is able to employ psychic powers to complement their battlefield role. Such is their unity that each feels the other's pain. A wound suffered by one, let alone a death, is felt across the mental link by all, and the loss of the sergeant can leave the squad stunned and without focus. Tactical and Devastator squads are able to telekinetically guide their shots to hit weak points in an enemy's armor, or to strike down those who believe themselves safely behind cover. Units specializing in close combat use their skills to block themselves from their opponent's sights, allowing them to approach undetected. The most skilled of veterans can even use their powers to read what an opponent will do, even as they think it, an advantage they use to the full in the brutal melee of the battlefield. By the time a brother has earned the right to wear Terminator armor, his skills are all but mature. At this stage, they are able to channel their psychic might through the crystalline matrix of a force weapon, and the long, arduous training to lead a squad of their own can begin. The Thousand Sons' homeworld of Prospero was originally colonized by outcasts from human society, in particular by those gifted with psychic talents who wished to escape the baying mob. By the time Magnus the Red arrived on their world, they had constructed a haven of enlightenment, a place where learning was pursued for the simple joy of it. The psychic gifts displayed by the population were a perfect match for Magnus's new legion, and under the Primarch's aegis, psychers flocked to Prospero from across the Segmentum. New cities mirroring the beauty of the capital were constructed, and this influx of hardy, resourceful immigrants improved still further the quality of recruits available to the Legion. This idyll was short-lived though, with even the oracles of Tisca unable to foresee the global destruction the corrupted space wolves wrought upon the world. Despite the best efforts of the Thousand Sons, the cities were blasted to rubble, its libraries burned to ash, and the population brutally exterminated. After the heresy, with Prospero nothing more than a mass grave, the Thousand Sons felt no reason to return there. The place held too many memories and ghosts of dead friends, with Magnus laboring to modify the Astronomicon to sustain the Emperor's essence, and the Thousand Sons' invaluable psychic talents put to use in eliminating the taint of the daemonic from the very heart of the Imperium. They began to regard Holy Terra as their new home. Quietly, and with the consent of friends among the High Lords of Terra, such as Lorgar and Abaddon, the Legion fortified and expanded the complex used to carry out the soul-binding ritual into their new fortress monastery. From this imposing edifice of silver and white, the Thousand Sons select recruits from amongst those psychers brought in by the back ships. They are tested in any number of ways, the final one being the ritual of soul binding. Those who survive are declared ready for training, and for the gene seed implantation process to begin. In the early years of the Legion's history, there were severe problems with spontaneous mutations, both the body and among their gene seed implants. With the advent of the soul binding, the incidences of this dramatically reduced. This communion with the Emperor has been described as alleviating the innate mutability of the Magnus gene seed, although at the time critics claimed it had more to do with the Legion being forced to forego the corrupting influence of sorcery. Despite this, the Thousand Sons still suffer more from spontaneous mutation than any other Loyalist Legion. Although the use of bionic limbs to replace ones lost in combat is common among the Emperor's Astartes, for the Thousand Sons, the cause is more likely to be due to the effects of progressive mutation. This instability also extends to the Magnus gene seed. While it continues to enhance the psychic talent of the recipient, its inherent mutability shows a noticeable decline in implant efficiency within a bare handful of generations. Although this has been remedied by the frequent infusion of fresh gene stock derived directly from their Primarch, this dependence is yet another cause for concern over Magnus's frequent and lengthy disappearances. Even beyond their anxiety over the risk of losing their primogenitor, the Thousand Sons realized that his death would also be the harbinger of their own extinction. The Thousand Sons believe that the only way humanity as a species can ultimately defeat the ruinous powers is for it to gain sufficient psychic strength and fortitude to resist its predations. This brings with a great dilemma, as their very existence and that of the Emperor relies upon the Black Ships, which bring in a constant harvest of psychers from across the Imperium. How, they ask, can humanity increase its psychic potential when psychers live in fear of the howling mob, and while the finest talents are constantly being removed from the gene pool? To this end, the Legion yearns to reconstitute the original dream of Prospero by creating isolated havens for those with psychic talents. Whenever this has been tried over the millennia, it has ended in disaster, either through mass demonic incursion or resentment from neighboring cities at the extensive and preferential protection offered by the Thousand Sons to these settlements in times of war. Their staunchest critics leap upon such plans as evidence that the Thousand Sons are intent on the forcible replacement of humanity with those of the mutant psyker strain. There are some amongst the Legion who whisper that in the face of such hatred, perhaps this would be a good thing. They are, however, in a very small minority, and the Legion continues to fight as loyally for the Imperium as it has since the day that Magnus first knelt in fealty to the Emperor. As for their battle cry, as the Thousand Sons are able to communicate far better telepathically than with mere words, the Legion rarely uses a conventional battle cry. Their silent, coordinated movements, along with their blank-faced helms, all contribute to their otherworldly image, inspiring fear in their enemies and unearned respect among their allies. It only took the false Emperor for Magnus and his Legion to escape the grasp of Tzeentch.